Hello everyone, I know you watched this video to accompany you to sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. I was 18 at the time, and it was the beginning of summer, so I was off from school, and I didn't have any job. The majority of my time was spent inside the house playing video games, watching YouTube or TV, or just relaxing. When this happened, my parents were out of town for a few days, leaving me with the house. This was a common thing, and was never a big deal. Sometimes I'd invite friends over or whatever, but this night I was just enjoying the time to myself. I was watching a rerun of one of my favorite shows on Netflix while also scrolling through my phone. It was late, I don't know the exact time, but I think maybe 11 or 12, when there was a knock at the front door. I paused the TV, and went to see who it was. It almost didn't even register in my mind that it was so late, but thankfully it did before I carelessly would have opened the door. I looked in the peephole and saw two men, both wearing similar clothes and just waiting for me to answer. I stood there and thought for a second whether or not to let them know I was home by asking what they wanted. I ended up staying quiet and just watching to wait for them to leave, but a few seconds later they called out, "Hello, we're here looking to speak with Mr. and Mrs. Ian." That was my parents they were referring to, though I changed the name for privacy. Confused that I still remained quiet, knowing it was far too late for any sort of visit even if it was important. After a minute, the men looked at each other and said something quietly, then walked off the porch. The outdoor lights were off, so I couldn't see where they went, but I never saw any headlights or cars show up, which had me wondering if they'd walked here, which would only make things weirder. I went back to the TV, but left it on pause for a while, so I could hear if they came back. It only took a few minutes, until I heard a pair of footsteps outside the house. They went up to the porch, but instead of knocking like they did before, they started making their way around to the side of the house. I got up and ran to the back window. As they got to the backyard, I saw them open the fence and enter, and I hid away from the window so I wouldn't be seen, but I could hear them go up to the back door. They started talking, then began messing with the door. I took this as my chance to get my phone and hide inside the garage. I called the police explaining the possible break-in that was taking place, and after less than a minute, a loud pop sound vibrated through the house, and the back door slid open. Their footsteps went through the house, and straight to the stairs going up to the bedrooms. A door opened, they entered, then closed it behind them. But after that, there were no more sounds. I waited for a horrifying and slow 10 minutes in silence before the police pulled up to the house. When they did, there was a few quick footsteps upstairs. Then the two men started arguing. A few officers came in through the back door and ran upstairs while another came to the garage and helped me outside. The men didn't resist the rest, but they also didn't speak a word on why they were there. Despite weeks going by and it being somewhat obvious that they weren't simply robbing the house, the only thing they could charge them with was breaking and entering. It scares me though that they seemed to be looking for my parents, and it almost felt like they were going to wait upstairs for them until they came back from their trip. I think back to whether or not I should have shown myself, and if that would have stopped the break-in, but something about their behavior tells me that they still would have broken in and would have done to me whatever was necessary. Story 2. I live on the outskirts of a mid-sized town in Wyoming. The whole reason I live here is because owning a huge plot of land isn't as impossible of a task as it can be in most other states. My house is small, but it was cozy enough for living alone. This happened 4 years ago, in 2019. It was spring, and we were going through a month of pouring rain almost every single day. It was a Sunday, and I was home from work, spending the day watching TV and resting. Sometime around 6 or 7, I got an unexpected knock at my door. I barely heard it through the rain, and when I entered the door, I was even more surprised to see it was some random guy. Not a mailman or anything of the sorts. Someone coming all the way out onto my property without notice was very unusual, being that it was far out of the way. "How can I help you?" I said. The guy, looking somewhere in his late 20s, said he'd been camping out in the woods nearby and had gotten into some trouble and needed a place to stay for the night. With the location of my house, if he wasn't lying, then showing up at my doorstep would make sense because I was the closest place within the woods by at least 5 or 6 miles. It was also pouring out, which made me feel even worse for him, but it still didn't take away from the possible danger of letting a stranger into my home. I offered him a phone call to get a ride into town, but the guy denied my offer. After bluntly saying he couldn't stay here, the guy walked off. I watched him go down the dirt road a little ways, then he veered off and walked into the woods. As odd as that was, I didn't have it on my mind for more than a few minutes before I was back to watching TV. I didn't check the time very often, but it had to be at least 2 hours later, and well into the night, when I saw an orange glare coming from the window by my backyard. I got up and moved the curtain. Through the rain and fog, I saw a campfire right in the middle of the woods outside my house. It was small, flickering under a large tree as the rain poured down on it. Standing next to it, there was the outline of a figure holding something. I couldn't tell though if he was facing my house or into the woods. After a moment, I closed the curtains and picked up my phone, calling the police to let them know about this person outside my house. I knew it would take probably an hour for them to get here, and whoever was out there wasn't doing me any harm, but at the very least I wanted them away from my house before I went to bed. Once I got off the phone with the officer, I checked the window again. The fire was still burning lightly, but the figure wasn't there. Then I heard footsteps coming toward the house. I ran to the other window and caught sight of him walking past with a hunting rifle in his hand before he turned the corner and went to the front door. He banged on it a few times, then it went quiet. I grabbed my self-defense handgun from the hallway closet and hid around the wall, still trying to process the situation I was in. He hit the door again. This time I could tell it was with the stock of his rifle, nearly breaking a panel out of the door. In this moment, I could only think that I had to try to deter him immediately before it becomes life or death for one of us. I shot around toward the edge of the door frame, deafening myself for a second as the shot rang through the house. When my hearing came back, all I heard was the rain pouring down. No footsteps, banging, or yelling. I gathered up courage after 5 minutes of no sounds and looked out the peephole, seeing an empty porch and outside in the yard were clear footprints going away from the house. He must have run right after the shot during the couple seconds I couldn't hear. Out by where the campfire was, they found a duffel bag with evidence of it having been buried nearby and likely dug up just hours before the attack. What they told me is that it was most likely a burglary kit, or possibly even a murder kit, that was planted in advance with the intent to be dug up and used later on. This means whoever attacked me had planned it and had been right outside my house at least once before that night. Why he attacked me specifically is not known, and who and where he is currently is still no closer to being figured out than it was 4 years ago. I still live in the same house and worry every day that he might come back. Story 3. When I was growing up, I lived with my mom in a small house. During my middle school and high school years, she took up an overnight job, so most nights of the week I was alone between 8 p.m. and 4 a.m. This happened a few months before I graduated high school. On a regular night at 7:30, I said goodbye to my mom like usual. Then I played some video games for a few hours. It was a school night, so I couldn't stay up super late, but I still stayed up later than I should have. Around 11:30, I shut everything off and went up to my room to get in bed, but I was on my phone for probably another hour before falling asleep. When I woke up, I thought I heard a door closing downstairs. I looked over at the clock next to my bed and saw it was 3:30, so I assumed my mom had just gotten home from work early. I turned over and tried to go back to sleep as I listened to footsteps walking around downstairs. After a minute, though, I started listening more intently. Usually my mom would go straight upstairs when she got home to get ready for bed, but it sounded like they were just walking around. As I listened for another 2 or 3 minutes, I realized they weren't even stopping at all. They were going through each room, walking slowly as if they were taking a tour of the house. I started to get a little nervous that it might not be my mom and could be someone else. I got up and turned on the light in my room, and almost right away the footsteps stopped. I listened from the other side of my door and still heard nothing. I was expecting to see some light coming from downstairs, but the whole house was dark. Whoever was walking around down there hadn't turned on any of the lights, which frightened me more than I already was. I made sure not to make any sounds and stepped further down the hallway until I was at the top of the stairs. Then I knelt down and looked through the railing to see into the living room. Nobody was there, and even in the dark, I could tell that nothing had been moved at all. My PlayStation was still there, and in my head, that was a telltale sign that there was nobody else in the house except for maybe my mom. I mean, if someone was here to rob us and had walked through the whole house, they definitely would have taken the most expensive thing in the room. At that point, I just wanted to know if it was my mom who was walking around, or if I was having some weird auditory hallucinations. I walked down the steps to the bottom and called out, "Mom, you home?" There was no response or signs of movement in the whole house, so I walked through the hallway into the kitchen. Right away, I saw a shoe print on the tile floors, and when I looked up, my eyes locked on a figure. Across the room, a man was sitting at the dining table with the dark mask on. His clothing was all black, which made it difficult to fully make out any features of him. He was looking at me, but he didn't say anything or even move. He stared at me with an emotionless look. I ran straight back upstairs and locked myself in my room as I called 911. The operator kept me updated on the police's estimated arrival, but after a minute, I heard the man slowly walk across the downstairs and over to the bottom of the staircase. I was whispering to the operator in a panic until I heard the front door open and the man walking away from the house. Not even 30 seconds later, I saw headlights shining through the window. My mom pulled into the driveway, and I ran outside to meet her and tell her what was going on. When police got there, they did a thorough search and found nothing incriminating that would help us find the man. But from what it seems, the man wasn't there to rob us. He also didn't seem to have any interest in me either, which means that he was most likely trying to hurt or abduct my mom. It would then make sense why he broke in only minutes before my mom usually gets home. It makes me think about what could have happened if I hadn't gone downstairs to see who was, or if my mom had gotten home just a minute earlier and gone inside, unknowing of the man that was waiting for her. Story 4. I'm 32 and live alone in a rural house. I have a few neighbors half a mile down that I talk to sometimes, but I mostly keep to myself and only go into town when I need to. I'm half retired, so I spend most of my time at home, but a few months out of the year, I do some contracting work. At the time it was late fall, and on this day I was getting all of my equipment from out in the yard and storing it in the shed to prepare for the winter season. It was just a bunch of tools and lawn mowers and stuff like that I'd left out. Anyway, while I was outside, I saw something unusual. A man was walking along the road that connected to my driveway. He had nothing on him, no backpack or camping gear. For context, this road he was on was entirely empty aside from the few houses like mine, and the town was a 4-hour walk away. I watched him until he disappeared far off down the road. After he was gone, I looked down in both directions and saw no cars on the side of the road on either direction. It was really odd, but after a while I stopped thinking about it and finished up with my yard. I was back inside before dark and made dinner while I cooled off. As I sat there, a sudden thud from outside startled me up from the table. It was a wooden thump like it had come from where the shed was. I looked through the window out into the yard, and the door to the shed was wide open. It was old, but the door had never unlatched on its own like that before. Still unsure of exactly what was going on, I knew I had to check on it and close the door at the very least. I got my rifle just in case, but I was confident it wasn't going to be anything dangerous. Walking out to the shed, I listened carefully and heard nothing other than the quietness of the night. I looked around the field as well and saw no signs of wildlife or people. When I got to the open shed door, I turned on my flashlight and shined it inside. Nothing looked out of place. I stepped in and did a more thorough search for any animals hiding, but still there wasn't anything. I closed the door to the shed and made sure it was secure, then started walking back. As I made my way through the field toward my house, an eerie feeling grew inside me. I didn't know what it was, but it continued to grow as I reached the front door. I stepped in and locked the door behind me. As I walked into the hallway, I saw a shoe print right on the floor. I flipped on the light, and going across the hallway was a line of dirty shoe prints leading up to the spare bedroom. My heart started beating faster as I held my rifle up and took a deep breath. Then carefully walked up to the door. I leaned my head against the wood and listened, hearing what sounded like someone breathing right on the other side. Before I could even think on what to do next, the handle twisted from my grip and the door swung open. I jumped back and held the rifle up as a man looked like he was about to charge at me, holding a huge metal shovel up. I think my gun stopped him in his tracks though. He stood in the doorway, holding the shovel like a weapon and having a face full of rage. I yelled as loud as I could for him to stay back, trying to sound intimidating, but I was undoubtedly terrified. The man kept his distance, but his face full of anger never faded. From this moment though, I didn't know what to do. The cops wouldn't be able to make it here for probably an hour if I called, and I definitely didn't want to hold him at gunpoint for that long, risking anything to happen. As we stood in a strange silence, the man suddenly threw the shovel in my direction, then sprinted back into the room. I ran in to see what he was doing and watched him start crawling out of the window. Part of me wanted to stop him, but another part of me couldn't get myself to. He jumped out and ran off into the field, escaping in the vast, empty night, with no way of knowing where he was running off to. To this day, that man has never been identified, and his intentions are unknown. All I can say is that if I hadn't had my rifle in my hands, or if he had gotten the jump on me, I likely wouldn't be here today. Story 5. I don't go on many trips out of town, so this was one of the few times I've had to stay somewhere other than a friend or family's house. The area I needed to stay in was small, and most of the hotels didn't look very nice. But to my surprise, there was a single home listed on Airbnb. It was my first time using the site, but the house looked like a decent place, much better than the hotels. I requested the dates, and in a few minutes the place was booked. The following week, I started the drive. When I got to the town, which was about 14 hours from my city, it was well into the night. The town almost looked deserted compared to where I was used to living. All the houses' lights were off, and all the stores were closed. No people or cars were out. Of course it was the middle of the night, so I didn't expect this small town to be lit up and active at this time, but it was still eerie considering I hadn't seen it during the day. I only came in with this as the first impression. The street that took me to the Airbnb was dark as well, leading through a winding forested neighborhood until I eventually ended up at the house. It was one of few that had its porch and outdoor lights on, but one window upstairs had a light coming through it as well. I figured the last customer had just made the mistake of leaving it on, so I thought nothing of it and started getting my stuff up to the front door. I got the key code from my email and opened the door, getting inside and locking the door behind me. I quickly put my stuff in the corner of the room, then went upstairs to turn off the light that was left on. It was one of the spare bedrooms, only having a bed and a small dresser in it. I flipped it off, then went to the main bedroom to set up my things. I was only staying for the one night, but I had it booked for 2 because I needed to be there late into the following day. I was up for no more than an hour before finally getting in bed and turning in for the night. I rested my eyes and tried to sleep, but was laying awake for a long time. I sat up quickly, hearing a thud run through the walls of the house. I stared at the door, trying to think what could have been the cause of the sound, but with no ideas coming to mind, I got up to check. I opened the door softly, peering into the upstairs hallway. It was dark and quiet now. No more thuds, only the sounds of the house swaying in the wind. I stepped back and quietly shut the door, but a strange feeling came to me that had me wait as I thought more about the sound I heard. As I stood there, soft creaks started to go along the floorboards from the other room. I listened with my ear against the door as the creaking moved into the hallway, and then began making its way toward the door. I was so in shock that I almost didn't realize that it had to be footsteps of someone approaching. My heart started racing as they came right up to the other side of the door. I put my hand tightly on the door handle to keep it from moving, and only a moment later I felt it pull down. As soon as I resisted it, they eased off. There was a small moment, before suddenly, the handle was forced down, and they slammed into the door. It swung half open before I pressed my body back into it. I only saw half of their face in the doorway, but in their eyes was an anger that I didn't expect to ever see. After a struggle, I somehow managed to push the door back into the latch and lock it. The man on the other side tried to get it back open, but after yelling a few unpleasant words towards me, he ran downstairs and out of the house. I was still catching my breath and my mind was racing, but I gathered myself up and dialed 911. For such a small town, they came shortly after. The owner of the Airbnb continued with the case after I left on the following day, but I wish I had kept up with it. That man seemed so desperate to get into my room and was in some state of rage, like he wanted to hurt me, as if I'd done something to him. Everything about it is disturbing, and I don't think I'll ever get it out of my head, but Airbnbs probably won't be something I take part in again for a long time. Story 6. This was about 3 years ago. I was staying in a rental house while vacationing to see my brother. He lives 6 hours away from me, so I don't get to see him very often, and he only has a 1-bedroom apartment, which makes me have to stay elsewhere when I do see him. The house I rented out was really close to my brother's apartment and was the same price as nearby hotels, so it was an easy choice to go for the house. I had gotten into town early in the morning and met up with my brother for lunch, then got some groceries and was back at the rental around 5 o'clock. The place didn't have a lot to offer other than a couch, TV, and bed, but for the price I wasn't expecting too much. I stayed up until 9, then got in bed. It had been a long day, so I was looking forward to getting a good amount of shut-eye. I laid in bed awake for longer than I wanted, falling asleep after an hour. When my eyes opened, The room was in full darkness, and I could sense that it was the middle of the night. Before I could even check the time, though, I heard something outside the room. Footsteps slowly walking down the hallway, and then a door closing softly followed by silence. It was like my whole body had frozen, laying in the bed still and staring through the dark room. After a minute passed of no more sounds, I got up and looked into the hallway. At the far end, I could see the front door, which I knew was the door I'd heard them close, but I didn't know if they were still in the house or if they had left. I quietly walked through the other rooms, not seeing anyone. Actually, the only sign of them having been here was the front door being unlocked. I didn't see any footprints or notice anything missing. After checking the locks on all the doors, I called 911. They came fairly quick, but didn't do much of anything. They said to make sure all the doors were locked and to contact the owner, but aside from their useless advice, they provided no intent to figure it out. I stayed up that night and waited until morning, unable to sleep. After calling the owner of the rental and discussing what had happened, I went to see my brother. While out, the owner let me know that he'd changed the PIN code on the door, which did make me feel a lot better. I was out until late that day, though, getting some dinner and drinks with my brother and being dropped off at the rental sometime between 8 and 9. I went to the couch and sat down, feeling sleepy, but also feeling that nervousness again about the situation. Every time my eyes were about to close, my head would be filled with fear of the intruder coming back. Knowing I needed to sleep tonight since I didn't get any last night, I decided to go through the house again and check the rooms in hopes to ease my mind. I walked around the living room and kitchen, then went down the hallway to the bedroom. I opened the closet and checked the attached bathroom, and just before I walked out, I heard footsteps running through the hallway toward the bedroom I was in. I swung around the corner and only caught a glimpse of a large man as he slammed the bedroom door shut. Then I heard his footsteps departing and going toward the living room while I stood in place and just listened. He went all around the living room and kitchen, staying inside the house for probably 2 minutes before I heard the front door open and close behind him. Police came quickly after I called again, and this time the homeowner came by as well. The living room and kitchen looked like they'd been ransacked. The furniture was scattered all over, and the cabinets were all open with the things inside them having been tossed over the floor. After a closer look, though, the owner didn't see anything that was missing. It looked more like whoever that man was looking for something very specific and nothing more. I left the rental and got a hotel after that, and within a few days, I was never updated again about anything. I assume he was never found, but the situation has left me with a lot of questions. Something that really gets to me is that I had checked the entire house that one night. So where was he hiding? How long had he been in the house with me? Was he watching me? And what would have happened if I had fallen asleep on the couch? Story 7. I was 22 at the time and living in a very small one-bedroom house in the cheapest area of my city. After work on a Friday night, I hopped online to game with a bunch of my friends. It was the perfect night for staying up late, with heavy downpour outside and no work or school the next day. We played for probably 2 hours before a sudden sound had me put everything on pause for a minute. It was a thump sounding like it was upstairs. My initial concern was a possible leak in the roof caused by the rainfall, so I went up to look. The only rooms upstairs were the single bedroom and a half bathroom, and neither of them had any signs of leaks anywhere, so I ran back down and got back online with my friends. I was on for a while, only getting off at 2 a.m. because everyone else went to bed. I shut everything off and sat on the couch with some snacks while I watched YouTube on my phone. 10 minutes in, I heard another thump. It was from upstairs again, but it was so muffled that it almost sounded like it was on the roof or something. I did an even more thorough search of both my bedroom and the bathroom up there, but there wasn't anything showing itself to be the cause of the sound. I was sure it wasn't thunder either, because it vibrated through the walls like something literally hitting the house. After 10 minutes of looking around, I was so determined to figure it out that I put on my shoes and went out into the rain to see if there was something more noticeable from outside. At first I saw nothing of significance, but then I noticed a tree branch getting pretty close to the side of my house. It was a large and sturdy branch, though, that was a good 3 or 4 feet away from the siding, and even in the rain, it wasn't really swaying all that much. It seemed unlikely that it could reach the side and bang up against the side of the house. As I looked at it, though, I realized there was a small window on the house that the tree kind of covered up. It was higher than my bedroom window, meaning it had to be an attic. I had no idea there was an attic at this house. The hatch was definitely nowhere noticeable, and the roof wasn't a steep slope, so it didn't look like there would even be room for one. This hidden window was the first clue I'd ever seen to indicate there being an attic. I went inside, even more curious than I was before, and started searching for this hatch that I had to have somewhere. It took a minute, but I found it inside my bedroom closet. It was small and perfectly smooth with the ceiling, basically blending in aside from the tiny gaps from where it opens. I stood up on a box and pulled it down, releasing a rusty ladder from the opening. Immediately, I was hit with a rotten smell, followed by another thump sound. From below, I could tell the attic was extremely short, maybe 2 feet tall at most. I climbed up carefully and looked into this tiny space, basically a wide, dark tunnel. And at the end by the window, I could make out a figure, ducked down on all fours and looking straight at me. I almost fell off the ladder, trying to jump down and run away. I heard them shuffling around as I got my phone and left the house, calling 911 in my driveway. The cops got there and detained the man, who was just some homeless person. Apparently, he climbed the tree up to the window and made his way in, staying up there for at least a week without me having noticed. The absurdity of it all was almost unbelievable. I moved out very soon after that, and every house since, I've always checked the attics. But the one thing that has stayed with me is the image of that man at the end of the attic on his hands and knees staring at me with eyes resembling both fear and anger. Story 8. For the past few years, I've been working 2 jobs and typically leave my house around 6 in the morning and don't get home until 10 at night. Then I sleep, and on most days I repeat that same schedule. Unfortunately, that's just the situation I've been in for a while, but this happened just a couple months ago. I had come home one night and did what I usually do, which is shower and get ready for bed, but while I was in the shower, I heard some movement that sounded like it was just outside the bathroom door. I quickly got out and checked and saw nothing, so I figured it just had to be the house creaking or something. I finished cleaning up and got in bed. All throughout the night, I kept hearing these odd noises coming from all throughout the house, mostly just some sort of creaking, kind of like if it was really windy outside and making the house sway, but there was no wind and no reason for the house to be making any noise. At one point in the middle of the night, I even got up and walked around to try and find out what it was, but I found nothing. In the morning, I was very tired and had to work the whole day relying on coffee to keep me awake. By the time I got home, I was exhausted and sleepy, really hoping for a good night's sleep. I went right upstairs and turned the shower on, but before I even got in, I heard something outside the bathroom door again. This time I was sure it was right outside the door, and it sounded like it passed right by and left the bedroom. Although as unlikely as it was, it really sounded like something had moved across my room. I knew I had to look to see if someone was there, but I was feeling really uneasy. When I did finally get the courage to look, I didn't see anything. I walked through the whole house and did a quick look around each room, but I was convinced it had to be something odd going on inside the walls or under the floorboards. I showered and got in bed, falling asleep just before midnight. The instant I woke up, I knew something was wrong. It was very dark, so it was still well into the night, and the entire house was silent. I wasn't sure what had woken me up, but I could feel that it had something to do with the sounds I'd been hearing. I peered over at the door and saw the slightest movement of a shadow from under the crack. I jolted up and stared across the room. My heart immediately started racing as I saw the shadow move away from the door and heard them begin walking down the upstairs hallway. I was horrified and frozen in fear, but it must have been the surge of adrenaline that got me out of my bed and made me swing open the door. I looked out, and standing at the end of the hallway was the dark outline of a man. His eyes were the only thing that really stood out to me. They pierced through me with a sense of anger and restlessness. I slammed my bedroom door shut and locked it. The man's footsteps immediately went down the stairs, but it took another 30 seconds before I heard him leave the house. I got the police to come as soon as possible, but they didn't have much luck. They found a few signs of the man being in my house for at least a few days, but that was about it. I don't know where he was hiding, but I always think back to when I'd hear him walk past the bathroom door. Maybe he was sleeping in my bed, then quickly would hide in the closet until I got in the shower, where he would take the opportunity to leave the room. I also wonder why he spent that extra time downstairs before leaving the house when he knew I'd seen him and had likely called the police. Everything is just speculation at this point, but knowing that some random man was hiding in my house while I was sleeping is a horrifying thing to think about. As far as I know, the man hasn't come back, and there have been no updates on his identity. Story 9. Last year I moved into a new house far from the city. My new job was work from home, so I had no reason to be in a clustered and expensive city anymore. For the first couple months, I was enjoying everything about the place, especially it being so far from other people. But on a regular weekday afternoon, I got a knock at my door. This was actually the first time anyone had come up to my door at this place since I moved in, so it caught me a little off guard. I went up and opened the door to a tall, middle-aged man. "How can I help you?" I smiled to be friendly, thinking he was probably a neighbor from down the street. But strangely, the first thing he did was lean to the side and look past me into my house. It was like he was trying to see who else was home. Being weirded out by his behavior, I pulled the door in and blocked the way with my body. Before saying anything, the man turned and walked away from the door. I stayed and watched him go all the way down the driveway and continue walking until he got to the street, where he got into a parked car and drove off. Without a doubt, that was the strangest encounter I'd ever had with someone up until that point, and I really had no idea how to even think about it. That night, I stayed home for dinner just to make sure the man didn't come back. I debated calling the police to put in a report, but I thought I'd sound stupid for doing that just because some man came up to my door and did nothing. Around 9 p.m., I turned on the TV and tried to get myself more relaxed before trying to sleep. While I was on the couch, though, I heard a voice speaking outside. I quickly muted the TV and listened. It was muffled, but I could make out at least two separate people talking somewhere in the back of my yard. I ran up to the back window and opened up the blinds. In the distance, I could see two figures walking across my backyard. One of them had a long tool or object in his hand, but the other one was too hard to see clearly. They walked between the trees in my yard until they reached the side of my house. I went over to the side window and tried to see where they went, but I lost track of them and they had stopped talking. I checked every window and still couldn't see or hear them anymore. The loud knocking at my front door made me jump and sent chills through my body. I walked up, tried not to make any noise, and looked through the peephole. There was one man dressed in dark clothing and wearing a hat that covered his eyes. He had to be one of the men I'd just seen, but where was the other? "What do you want?" I yelled, figuring they likely already knew I was home, or maybe I'd scare them away. The man stayed on the doorstep and looked over at the side of my house, then looked back at the door. After a few seconds, the lack of response started to terrify me. I went back to the living room to get my phone and call the police, but was interrupted by a loud smashing sound followed by another and another. I looked across the hall and saw a man hitting a shovel against the back door. He saw me and looked at me for a second, then ran away. I was so scared, I hesitated on whether to call the police or try to find somewhere to hide. The best answer was obviously to do both, but my thoughts were interrupted again when I heard the side window getting hit. I got my phone and dialed 911 while the man continued to hit the window over and over, but just as the police picked up the phone, everything went quiet, and it stayed quiet until the police came. When they pulled in, I was surprised by a sudden commotion outside. It turned out to be the man at the door who had chosen not to leave, and after a closer look, it was the same man who'd come by earlier that day. Strangely, when the police detained him, he refused to say anything about the other man that was with him. He denied everything over and over, even though there were clear cracks and dents in the doors and windows. It was frustrating to listen to, and even weeks later, the man still refused to detail why he had come by my house twice that day, or who the other man was. Everything remains so unanswered that it still creeps me out to this day. Why was the man trying to break in so bad? And what purpose did the man at my doorstep serve to aid in the break-in? I moved away in the following months, and have since only been hoping that it wasn't me they were after, or are still after. I was using Craigslist to sell an office chair that I no longer wanted. It wasn't broken or damaged, and was barely even used, but I just didn't need it anymore. It took a few days, but eventually I got a message from a man who was interested in buying the chair. We had a short phone call, and he seemed like any other nice guy. He was willing to pay my asking price too, so everything seemed perfect. Set to meet at a local Walmart parking lot, which I opted for to keep it in a public setting. Come Friday afternoon, I called the man and let him know I was on my way. Then I drove down to the Walmart and got there right on time. He said he drove a gray Honda Civic, which I realized was very generic and basically useless information. He knew which car I drove too, so I was hoping he'd see me at least and come over, but time ticked away and there was no sign of him. I sent a text and a few minutes later I called, but now he wasn't picking up. I stayed in the lot for nearly an hour waiting for him to show, but as the sun was going down I decided to just go home. For most of the drive, I was just annoyed and upset that I'd had to waste my time for absolutely no reason. But about halfway back, I realized that a car had been behind me for a while. I got nervous about it, but once I pulled into my street, they turned away. After going inside and tossing my phone and stuff on the counter, I went back out to bring the chair inside. As I walked down my driveway, a car pulled up along the road and parked right in front of my house. I couldn't tell for sure, but it looked very similar to the car that was behind me earlier. It was a dark red sedan, looking to be at least 15 years old with rust all around it. I quickly got my chair out of my car and went inside, closing the garage and locking all the doors. I peeked out the windows and watched as the car just sat right in front of my house, still running and everything. I checked my phone to see if the man had ever responded, and he still hadn't, and that's when it all really started making me nervous. After another minute, I heard a car door open and close. I looked out the window again and saw a figure in dark clothing standing beside the car, but he was facing the house as if he was inspecting it. Once I saw that, I closed the blinds and dialed 911, explaining to the operator that a creepy man was outside my house and that I think he followed me home. They sent an officer on their way, and I thanked them, then hung up. I pushed the blind up slightly and checked out the window one more time. His car was still there, but the man was gone. I could feel my heartbeat getting faster as I went around to each window and looked, but it wasn't until I got to my back door that I saw the man again. He was standing inside my fenced backyard and was looking up at my house. I didn't know what he was doing, but it was really creeping me out, and all I could think was that at any moment he was going to try to break in. After a second, the man started walking to the side of my house. I went back to the front window to see if he was going back to his car, but he didn't reappear. Then I went around to every window again, trying to find him, but a few minutes later, the police showed up. The car was still left outside my house, and the man was nowhere to be found. What's worse is that the car was completely empty, not having a single piece of paper, or even a fingerprint anywhere inside or outside of it. It was apparently bought from a junkyard years ago, but that was the earliest record they had of it. The police were just as weirded out as I was, especially since the man just disappeared, leaving his car behind and showing no effort to break in. One thing we can say almost for certain is that it was likely the same man from Craigslist who had used an untraceable email and account and followed me from the Walmart parking lot to my house. It's been a couple months since all of this, but I still worry because why else would he have taken the time to inspect my house on all sides if he wasn't planning on coming back any day now to finish whatever it was he came to do? Story 10. When I was 21, I made the poor decision to move out of my parents' house before I could afford a place on my own. It was something I'd actually planned out for months, searching for cheap apartments, roommates, and anything that could help me move out. For some reason, I just prioritized moving out on my own over everything else. After months of searching, I found a post on Facebook about a room for rent in my area. It was a 2-bedroom house, and the owner was renting out the second bedroom. I sent him a message on Facebook and got a reply in minutes. He asked a couple of questions, then sent over a document. It looked like a huge list of rules for moving in, all simple stuff that's pretty much common sense. After agreeing to all the rules, he let me come over to look at the room that same day. When I got there, I was very surprised at how clean and well put together the place was. It looked like it was a model house, so perfectly decorated and furnished. The owner, Terry, was a little bit weird though. He was in his late 20s, but his personality and looks didn't match the way the house looked. He was wearing a dirty t-shirt and just had a weird way of talking. Still, I was blinded by the possibility of moving out that I didn't even care. A week later, I packed up a rental van with my stuff and drove it down to the house. When I walked inside, I almost thought I'd walked into the wrong house. It was so empty, no decorations or furniture, except for an old couch in the living room. It was a completely different looking place than the one I'd seen the first time. Terry was standing there and acted like nothing was different, talking my ear off about how excited he was to have a roommate. I asked about all the furniture and everything, but he basically ignored my question and just went straight to moving my stuff into the house. Being a little weirded out, I still moved in. Several weeks went by, and to be honest, I rarely even saw Terry. He was always working and didn't get home until late at night, but about a month in, I started realizing that Terry had stopped coming home most nights. It was maybe once a week I'd hear him get home around 2 or 3 a.m. He'd hang around downstairs for a while, then leave and wouldn't show up for another week or so. Part of me didn't care because I was happy to have the house to myself, but another part of me was curious about what he was up to. I mean, he wanted me to move in so bad, but now he's never here. Then one night at 2 a.m., weeks since I'd last seen Terry, I was woken up to him banging on my bedroom door and yelling my name. I got up and rushed over. Terry was standing in the doorway with sweat dripping from his head and a look of anger. "Do not leave your room," he said in a harsh voice, then grabbed the door and ripped the handle out of my hands, slamming it shut. I stood there in shock, listening to him walk downstairs. I opened the door quietly, and after a few seconds, I heard the sound of him dragging something heavy across the floor and into the garage. I ran downstairs to see what was going on. There was a smear of mud and dirt going across the kitchen and leading up to the garage door. I tried to open it, but he'd somehow locked it from inside. I realized it was best to just remove myself from the situation and ran out to my car, driving away while calling the cops. When they got to the house, Terry was already gone, and the smears on the floor had been cleaned up. After some days of investigating, it turned out that Terry was actually renting the house from someone else, so I wasn't even allowed to have legally moved in, and all the documents he sent me and had me sign were fake. Terry likely wasn't his real name either, and as far as I know, he never showed back up after that. I don't know for sure what he was up to, but he was so adamant about me staying in my room that night, and with him vanishing afterward, he clearly had something horrible he was hiding. But what really confuses me is why he wanted me to move into the house and live with him so badly. I can't help but think that he had some sort of plans for me, and I barely got out of there without having to find out the hard way. Story 11. 3 years ago, I moved down a few states on the East Coast to a new city. Due to work and money, I couldn't make the trip to see the place before making the move, but I was only renting, so there wasn't too much risk in it. It was mid-September when the movers came and loaded everything up, then dropped it off at the house. The landlord was nice enough to let the movers in for me to unload, because I wasn't actually arriving there until the following week. It was a Monday evening when I finally arrived and saw the house in person for the first time. It was a mess with boxes everywhere and furniture laying all around, but the house itself was all right. The layout was interesting in that it was very separated. It was a single story with the kitchen and living room on one side of the house. Then on the other side was a long hallway with all the bedrooms and bathrooms. Since it was already late, I went to the master bedroom and started working on getting the bed put together, then shut off all the lights and went to sleep. I didn't have a clock set up yet, so I don't know what time it was, but in the middle of the night, I woke up to an odd sound. I thought it was a noise the house was making, but I wanted to see what it was, and if it was something I needed to let the landlord know about. I got up and walked over to the bedroom door. As I got closer, though, I realized it was coming from somewhere down the hallway. I opened the door, and it stopped almost instantly. The hallway was pitch black, so I flicked on the light, but nothing was there. I slowly walked down and peered into the living room. It looked the same as it had earlier, but I turned on the lights and looked around just to be sure. On the floor, there were a lot of footprints scattered between the boxes that were laying around. I knew it was likely from the movers, and with no other signs of anything, I went back to the bedroom. It took a while for me to fall asleep again, because I kept thinking about how the sound stopped as soon as I opened the door. I tried to come up with any possible way this could be the house making noises, but nothing came to mind. When I drifted back asleep, it felt like I only stayed asleep for a minute before I was woken up by a sudden thump followed by footsteps running down the hallway. My eyes shot open, and I looked over at my bedroom door. The door was wide open, and on the ground were clear footprints coming right up to my bed. I got up and hurried to see who was there, but by then they were long gone. All that was left were scuffed prints from them running away. I got my phone and called the police, locking myself in the bathroom until they arrived. When they did, they oddly found no signs of a break-in aside from the footprints. I convinced myself that they must have gained access during the week before I arrived at the house, but something still didn't sit right with me. After unpacking and checking each box, nothing seemed to be missing. It obviously makes me wonder what they were even doing in the house, but the biggest mystery is why did they walk up to my bed, and what was that thump sound that I heard just before they ran away? The landlord was eager to allow me to break the contract and move out, so long as I didn't say anything about the break-in publicly. At the time, it sounded like he just didn't want anyone to be scared away from the house, so that he wouldn't miss out on his rental income, but now I'm not so sure. Story 12. This happened a couple years back when I was 26. My single mother had just passed away, and being the only child, their house was left for me to either sell or move into. I was living in a really nasty apartment because I couldn't afford much back then, and after much deliberation, I decided to move into the house. It was already paid off, so I was saving a considerable amount of money by moving in. My goal was to hopefully save up for a few years and get back on my feet, then sell it and buy the house that I wanted. Once my lease was up at the apartment, I moved across town to the house. It was part of a community of farmland owners, but in the recent years, most of that land had stopped being used for farming and was left as just empty fields. That's what happened with my mom's land as well. It was pretty much just an old barn-style home in the middle of a huge field with only a small overgrown path leading to it. In the first week living there, I spent most of my time cleaning and getting all of my stuff where I wanted it. During one of these nights while I was cleaning, I heard a car coming toward the house. I looked out the window and saw an old pickup truck driving down the overgrown path. It was very strange, being that the only reason for them driving here would be if they were coming to the house, but just as they approached the end of the path, they slowed to a stop. I could make out a male figure in the driver's seat, but couldn't make out any specifics. They stayed there for a moment with their headlights shining over the field before they did a 3-point turn and drove away. I thought they probably just typed in the wrong address or something, but it was kind of creepy to see someone coming all the way out here so late in the night. A few days went by, and by then I'd finished getting the house cleaned up and organized. It was a Sunday night, and I was staying up late watching TV and eating a home-cooked meal when a familiar sound came up in the distance. A car driving toward the house. I looked out the window again and saw that same pickup truck coming down the path, this time with all its headlights off. Knowing it couldn't possibly be an accident this time, I was more worried. I quickly looked at my phone and saw it was nearly 1 a.m., so why would anyone be coming here? The truck came all the way to the front of the house and parked. Then a man got out and started walking up to the porch. I waited anxiously, but after a minute there was no doorbell or knocking. I cautiously went up to the front door and looked out the peephole. A man was standing right on the porch looking directly at the door. I was terrified as he looked like he was contemplating something. Then he turned around and went back to his truck, getting in and hurrying away. I was really creeped out, so I called the police and reported it, but there was nothing else to be done. I went to bed that night with a really bad feeling about everything. Apparently I was right, because I woke up to what I thought was the sound of a knock at the door. It was just a single knock. I got up right away and looked out the window, but the truck that I thought I'd see wasn't anywhere outside the house. I quietly left my bedroom to try and go downstairs and see who it was, but just as I reached the top of the steps, I could see that the front door was slightly open. I froze, and moments later, I heard footsteps walking through the hallway below me. I quickly hid in the spare bedroom that was next to me and dialed 911 as the footsteps grew louder and started coming up the stairs. They went straight into the main bedroom, and I could hear them moving stuff around, like they were looking for something. I was too scared to speak to the officer on the phone, worried the intruder would hear me, so I just sat there silently. They spent a few minutes going through the bedroom, before leaving and going back downstairs, and finally exiting the house. I started talking to the officer as I ran up to the back window to see if I could identify them before they got away. It was dark, but I could see that it was the same man who was on my porch earlier. He was walking in the backyard toward the field of tall grass, eventually disappearing in it. Police came by and tried to find any evidence to help with the case, but my description of the man was about all there was that was helpful. I don't know what that man wanted, but he seemed to be looking for something specific. It makes me think maybe he knew of something my mother had, and after hearing of her passing, he wanted to steal it. But once I realized he had to have known I was home, and probably in the bedroom, it terrified me to think about how he still went in and looked around. What was he planning to do to me if I was still in there? I ended up selling the house a month later because I was too scared of him coming back. Even now, I still check every few months to see if there were any reports of recent break-ins at that address. But it's been quiet ever since that night. Story 13. I stayed at an Airbnb about 3 years ago. There was no occasion. It was more of just a weekend getaway to spend some time off from work. The Airbnb was a cabin 4 hours away from my hometown. The cabin looked like it was mostly isolated, only having 3 or 4 other cabins within a mile of it, and the woods were right in the backyard. This was just what I was looking for, and I was super excited. When I arrived early in the morning, I explored the property and messed around with some of the cool features. In the afternoon, I sat outside on the back patio in one of those swinging chairs, and as I was looking out into the distance, I saw a man walking in the woods. He looked like a regular guy from what I could see, and I figured he was probably staying in one of those other cabins. He walked deeper into the woods until I couldn't see him anymore, and I continued enjoying the nature. I want to say I stayed out there for almost an hour before going inside and making dinner, then sitting down to watch a movie at the end of the night. During this movie, the doorbell rang. I didn't even know the cabin had a doorbell, but regardless, I went up and answered the front door. A man standing on the porch, and I recognized him as the guy I'd seen earlier in the woods. "How can I help you?" The man smiled wide and said he'd been lost for a few hours and needed help getting back to his cabin. I paused for a second, knowing there was something strange about this guy, but I couldn't quite figure out what it was. "Yeah, let me get my phone and you can search the address." I closed the door and went over to the couch, picking up my phone and going back, but when I opened the door, he was gone. He wasn't anywhere on my porch or in the front yard. I stood in the doorway for a second, then closed it and went back to the couch. I knew something was off about that guy, but this just didn't really make any sense. I stayed cautious for a while, but eventually I went to bed. I slept surprisingly well, and in the morning, I got up and went outside on the back porch to drink my coffee. But just 10 minutes later, I saw something I didn't expect to see. That man from yesterday was walking in the woods in the same place he was before, seemingly walking on the same path. One thing I knew for sure now was that he definitely wasn't lost. But then why did he come up to my cabin? I went back inside after seeing that and called one of my friends to tell them about this weird situation. It made me feel better to talk it over and have someone else be confused with me. But as we talked, I heard something that almost gave me a heart attack. The doorbell. I quickly whispered to my friend what was happening, and I left the phone call going while I answered the door. The man smiled and repeated the same thing he said yesterday about being lost and needing help. I looked at him with an annoyed and confused face. Then he spoke again. "Can you get your phone and search for the address?" My whole body went cold when he said that. I slammed the door shut and updated my friend, who told me I needed to get out of there right away. I agreed, hurrying to pack all of my bags. I checked the peephole to make sure the guy had left before I went out to my car. After shoving my bags in the back seat, I got in and started bagging out. As I did, the man appeared in the front window, standing inside the house, and watched me drive away. When I got home, I contacted the Airbnb owner and let them know about this crazy guy who broke into his rental. His response was very short, and he didn't even seem worried about it at all. He just apologized for me disliking my stay. I don't know what he was trying to do, but it had my head spinning the whole time. Even now, I still don't know what his plan was, but seeing him standing in the window inside the house just 30 seconds after I left was the most horrifying and creepy thing I'd ever seen. Story 14. I'm 29, and I live along the Appalachian Range in lower West Virginia. I've been going backpacking and camping for years, exploring different trails all around the nearby mountains. My best friend, who lives just a few miles from me, would often join me on these hikes. We usually planned one big trail every year in the fall, being anywhere from a few days to a whole week of backpacking and camping. In 2019, we planned to take a trail across the range to a small lake at the top of the mountains. In the days leading up to the trip, though, my friend had to call it off because of an emergency at his work. I'd already taken the whole week off of work and had everything ready to go, so I decided to just go alone. On Monday morning, I drove to a nearby trailhead, then started my route. This wasn't a regular recreational trail like you typically see on a 4-hour hike. These backpacking trails didn't have defined paths, so you have to use maps, compasses, and landmarks to navigate where you're going. Typically, there's a large landmark in the distance, like a specific rock formation that you hike toward, and when you get there you can see your next landmark, and so on. I spent the first 2 days hiking toward a ridge in the mountains. When it got dark on the second day, I set up camp several hours from reaching the ridge. I pitched the tent and got a fire going, then heated up some of the food I brought in my bag. The sun had already set, and it was around 8 o'clock when I laid in my tent to rest and read. I left the fire going, planning to put it out before actually sleeping. 20 minutes into reading, and through the fire crackling outside, I heard the strong sound of a stick snapping right behind my tent. I jolted up. My first thought was a black bear, possibly having smelled the food I cooked earlier. I didn't hear anything else though. I crawled out of the tent and shined a flashlight into the tree line behind my tent. Nothing. I called out aggressively to scare away any predators, but again, there were no sounds of anything running away. It was really strange because the stick snapping was very distinct, definitely being from something stepping on it. I stayed outside the tent for a while, looking around constantly before putting out the fire and going inside. I found it really hard to sleep that night, because I was so focused on listening for more sounds. In the morning, I was almost surprised to have even slept through the night. I packed my tent and everything else at the campsite, then continued along until I reached the ridge. From there, it was a straight shot to the lake. I was moving fast, trying to get there before dark, so I wouldn't have to move my campsite again the next day. I arrived with about an hour to spare before sunset. The lake was beautiful, very much worth the hike. I walked around it, enjoying the scenery, then pitched the tent and set up my camp on the treeline beside the lake. As I sat by the fire, I kept turning around, hearing soft noises somewhere between the trees behind me. I figured I was just being paranoid, but it was really creepy. It almost sounded exactly like footsteps, but I knew nobody would be out here. I would have seen their tent when I walked around the lake. It was too dark at this point to see anything further than a few feet, so looking around wasn't an option anymore. An hour later, I got in my tent and laid down. Every few minutes, I would hear footsteps again. They were barely too quiet for me to tell for sure what they were though. Eventually, I got so tired that I fell asleep. And what I think was only an hour after I fell asleep, I woke up to the sound of someone running away from my tent. I jolted up and grabbed my flashlight, rushing out of the tent and looking in the direction of the footsteps. I saw the bare back of them running away in the distance. My heart was beating rapidly. I looked down and saw footprints all around my tent, like they had been walking around me and searching the campsite. I tried to get the campfire going again, as fast as I could so I could see better. I was terrified. I had nowhere to go and nobody to help me. I sat at the fire all night, keeping my head on a swivel, but I never saw or heard anything else. In the morning, I snapped a few pictures of the lake, then started the hike back. I had planned to stay for a whole day. I wasn't comfortable anymore, feeling like I was being followed. I was able to make it back without any more trouble, thankfully. But, along my journey, I began noticing several things missing from my backpack. Small things like food, a few tools, etc. But I always had my bag with me. Even today, I wonder if whoever had been outside my tent that one night had actually snuck inside and stole from my bag while I was asleep. Even the thought of it makes my whole body shiver. Story 15. My roommate was out of the house for the week, so I had the place to myself. It was spring break, so my college classes were out too. I had no plans, and really nothing I needed to do. On Monday, I was basically trapped inside due to a huge storm blowing through our city. This was common around this time of year, but it still always seems worse every time it happens. The trees looked like they were going to blow away, and the house would shake and creak nonstop. Knowing I wouldn't be able to sleep, I decided to just stay up. I turned on the Xbox and started up one of my video games. I played for well over an hour, probably until 11 o'clock when the doorbell rang. I paused the game and got up, but then I remembered the whole storm and everything. We'd be outside right now. I went over to the front door and looked through the peephole. Nothing. I opened the door. The wind and water hit me right away, but when I looked around I didn't see anyone. I closed the door and thought maybe the wind had somehow rang the doorbell. I don't know, it sounds dumb now, but what was I supposed to think? I went back to my game, but only a couple minutes later, I heard a huge crash in the backyard. Stuff tumbling over and breaking. I immediately knew it was our patio furniture and ran over to the back door. Everything was scattered around the yard, blowing around in the wind. I quickly put on my shoes and went outside. I started pushing each piece of the furniture up against the back of the house. The wind was so heavy, it would even hurt sometimes when the water would hit my face. I was rushing, going as fast as I could, until I saw someone. They were standing at the edge of the backyard, watching me. I looked back at them for a moment, but then grabbed the last piece of furniture and ran inside to escape the rain. I looked out the back door as I dried off, but the person was gone. Between that and the doorbell ringing, I was a little bit nervous. I sat in the living room, this time just scrolling on my phone because I was tired of being interrupted. After a while, I struggled to keep my eyes open. I got a blanket and laid down on the couch. I didn't feel like going upstairs, and the storm was much louder up there anyway. It took a while, but eventually I drifted into sleep. A few hours later, still well into the night, I woke up from a sudden burst of heavy wind outside shaking the house. I pulled the blanket to the side and sat up, moving my feet to the floor as I prepared to go check if the furniture outside was still there. But just when my feet touched the floor, they were soaked. It woke me up immediately. I looked down and saw a puddle on the ground, right next to the couch. Then I saw another and another leading in a line across the floor. Inside the puddles were faint, muddy shoe prints. I stood up and ran to the corner of the room, heart beating rapidly in my chest. After a minute of hearing nothing but the wind outside, I slowly followed the shoe prints. They led all throughout the house, upstairs and downstairs, but I could clearly tell that they entered through the back door, which I had stupidly forgotten to lock in the rush of getting out of the rain. I locked it and pulled my phone out to call 911, but then the thought crept into my mind. What if they're still inside? I stayed quiet and moved into the corner of the house where I felt the most hidden, then called. I waited in silence for them to arrive. When they did, they took a look around, seeing everything I saw, but nothing more. They told me it seemed like a personal attack though, because nothing was missing, and they were clearly focused on my house in particular. However, they walked right up to me while I was sleeping and seemingly did nothing but watch me, which is super creepy, but doesn't make much sense. If they wanted to do something to me, they would have at that moment. After some thought, this had led me to believe that whoever it was had actually come for my roommate. They saw me, then looked around the whole house, and then left doing absolutely nothing. So if this was a personal attack and my roommate was there, I think things may have gone a lot worse than they had. Story 16. I was house sitting for one of my best friends last year. They had a few lizards and some fish that I had to feed, along with a bunch of house plants to water. They were on a 2-week-long business trip, so I agreed to take care of everything while they were away. Their house was a lot nicer than my apartment too, so I was glad to do it. The first week went by and it was great. It felt kind of like being in an Airbnb. But then one night, while sitting at the table in the kitchen, I heard a man cough right outside the house. It scared me because it was so close, being just outside the back door. I quickly walked over and turned on the outdoor lights to show that I was home. I waited a minute before looking out the window. Whoever was there was gone now, but why were they there in the first place? I stayed extra cautious for a while, but there was nothing else. It was a little past 7, and I had nothing to eat, so I went outside to go pick up some food. But as I was walking out, I noticed some footprints in the yard. The grass was pressed down, and there was a clear path they walked in. I followed them, going from the sidewalk to the back of the house, and then turning around and going back to the sidewalk. I got in my car and went out for food, but thought about it while driving. I couldn't come up with any reason someone would do that. It really just seemed pointless. When I got back to the house, I did a quick search for any more footprints in the grass, but didn't see anything. I went back inside and sat down to watch TV. After an hour, I was starting to get sleepy, so I shut it off and got in bed, sitting up on my phone for a bit. That's when I heard someone outside again. They were walking through the front yard. I listened as they went up to the front door, and then went around to the back door. I got up, more alert now as I heard the back door shifting around like they were trying to open it. I went to the top of the stairs and flipped the light switch, turning on the downstairs lights. The person stopped. I walked down a few steps, then leaned over the railing and looked at the back door. Nobody was there anymore, and for some reason, that terrified me even more. Seconds later, I saw shards of glass flying across the living room as I heard a window shatter. From where I was standing, I couldn't see it, but I immediately ran upstairs and into the bedroom. I heard a few coughs, then the glass crunching as they stepped inside. As soon as they were in, everything turned to chaos. It was like they were pushing everything over, hitting and breaking things. I called the police, but I feared they wouldn't make it in time to help me. After a minute of destroying the bottom floor, the intruder ran up the steps and went into one of the spare bedrooms, doing the same thing. Then he came up to the bedroom that I was in. He tried opening the door, but I had locked it. Instead of leaving, he started smashing something against it, trying to break it down. One of the panels from the door nearly flew off, allowing them to reach in and open it. The man stepped in. He was wearing a face mask and a hoodie, and was holding a metal baseball bat. I was in the corner of the room holding back tears as he looked at me in rage. But then he looked away and started smashing the walls and furniture all around the room. He didn't even acknowledge me. He just went around me, destroying the entire room in as little time as possible. Then he ran past me and went into the next room before he finally went downstairs and left the house. I stood in that same spot, frozen, until the police came. My friend came back early the next day to deal with the situation, but basically everything in the house was trashed and destroyed, but nothing was stolen. The police said it almost certainly had to be someone she knew that had something against her, but she couldn't think of anyone who would do this to her. I tried to give a description of the man, but he was fully covered, so I wasn't of much help. The most terrifying part was that the man just ignored me, confidently unthreatened by me. To this day, whoever that was hasn't been back to my friend's house, and their motive still remains unknown. Story 17. This happened to me last year. I worked at a gas station, which I know is very typical for these sorts of things, but when you actually work there, you never really expect anything to happen to you. This night, it was raining outside. Not too heavily, but enough to make it uncomfortable to be outside without any sort of covering. In weather like this, there's a lot less people coming into the convenience store to grab snacks or pay for gas with cash, so my job is to just be there. I'd occasionally walk around the store to stretch my legs and stay awake, but I'd spend most of my time on my phone. As I was looking through my social media feeds, I suddenly heard a strange noise coming from outside. It sounded like someone was tapping on the glass door. I looked up from my phone and saw a figure standing outside in the rain. It was a man, his face hidden by the hood of his jacket. I waved, showing he could just walk in and that the door wasn't locked. He didn't move though, he just kept tapping on the door as if he didn't see me. I walked over and pulled the door open, greeting him. He didn't look at me, but walked right past me and over to the counter. It was almost comical in my head how oblivious this guy was. I went back around the counter, and the man asked for a pack of cigarettes, then paid with cash. He walked out, and that's when I looked out the window and noticed there were no cars in the parking section or by the gas pumps. The man walked off until he reached the road, then continued walking along the shoulder, through the rain like it was nothing. I would have been a lot less confused if he had bought a gas container or something, assuming his car ran out down the road, or even broke down, but he just got a pack of smokes and left. With nothing better to do, that's all I thought about over the next hour. It was just such an odd thing. I came to no further sensible conclusions though, and ended up stocking some items to continue passing the time. While doing so, I heard someone tapping on the door again. I walked around the aisle and saw that same man standing outside. I walked over and opened the door. "Are you all right?" I asked. He didn't respond. "Borrow the phone if you need," I said, trying to offer any assistance. "Down the road," he said. I peeked my head out and tried looking, but saw nothing in the distance, but then my gaze fell on a gas container sitting by one of the pumps. He pointed at it and said help, which was when I realized he probably didn't speak much English. I said sure and walked out to the pump with him. He handed me a credit card, and I started pumping the gas into the container. The man was standing behind me like he was trying to stay out of my view, which made me uncomfortable. Once the container was full, I quickly handed it over and started walking back, but the guy stopped me, grabbing my arm. He started speaking quickly, but I couldn't understand him. I pulled away and started walking back to the doors, but then he yelled something like he was talking to someone else. And just as I reached the door, I saw a man on the other side of the counter shoving everything into his backpack. He looked up at me and instantly jumped over the counter, but then everything went black. I woke up laying on the floor with a massive headache. It seemed to only be a couple minutes after the incident, and I almost immediately realized that the guy behind me had hit me over the head in an effort to help his buddy escape. I got the cops over, and they took me to the hospital, but I had no serious injuries aside from a concussion and needing a few stitches. The worst part of it all is the embarrassment I felt afterwards, like I'd been played so easily, and let them get away with it. Honestly though, I'm thankful that I got hit over the head and blacked out before anything else happened, because the CCTV footage showed the guy inside holding a gun. If I had tried to stop him, or even shown I was a threat in any way, I could have been put down and never woken up. Story 18. I'm a 31-year-old female, and this happened when I was 29, back in 2020. My friend, let's call her Stacy, told me that she had a friend, who I'll call Brianne, that needed a dog sitter because Brianne and her husband were going on a vacation to California. Stacy knew my dog sat on an app called Rover, which is an app where you house sit random strangers' dogs, walk them, you name it. I thought it was the perfect opportunity, since I was in need of some cash. $200 to dog sit for 5 days. Why not, right? Brianne showed me around her house a week before I dog sat, while also letting me meet her huge husky named Bear. I'm not going to lie, it was a big husky, a little overweight too, but still adorable. Brianne told me that I was welcome to help myself to whatever food I wanted. The front door also included a lock where you punch in a number code to get in, so it was pretty secure. So, a week rolls around, and I showed up later on a Friday night, not too long after Brianne and her husband left the house to go to California. Things were pretty chill for the first 2 days. I was at work for most of the afternoon, went to feed the dog on my break, came back later at night, and would take Bear for rides in my car. I stayed up late watching movies, and let Bear sleep by me when it was time to go to bed. Anyway, after work on a Monday night, I hear a knock at the door. I look through the peephole, and it was a guy that looked like he was wearing a black police uniform. I thought it was a bit odd, but opened the door to see what was up. "Hello, I'm looking for a George," he said. "George," I thought. "Oh no, there's no George here. I'm dog-sitting for a friend. I've been here since Friday." Looking back, it was pretty stupid to tell a random person at the door I didn't know that I was alone. "Oh, okay. How long are you here?" he said. "Till Wednesday," I responded. "Oh, that's cool. Okay, sorry to bother you." And then he left. I was slightly weirded out and locked the door. I texted Brienne about what just happened. She pretty much just said, "Oh, don't worry about it," and shrugged it off. I thought that was weird too. Things were normal again up until I went to bed Wednesday at midnight. As I was laying in bed, the thought kept coming to my mind that I should make sure the front door was locked. So I got up and checked it. Luckily it was, but I still had a weird vibe. I fell asleep, then woke up at 3:05 a.m. to the dog barking like crazy. It freaked me out a little. I thought someone had broken in. I got up and went to the living room, where I saw Bear was growling and barking at the front door. I looked through the peephole and saw the same guy, with another guy this time, standing there in security guard uniforms. At this point, I was creeped out. Why would the same guy come back when he knew I was alone? I didn't bother opening the door this time. Two guys I didn't know dressed like security guards at 3 a.m. I made sure all the doors were locked. When I saw that they had walked off, I opened the door and didn't see any type of security car anywhere. I still have to think Bear. I think his barking could have been what scared them off. I went back inside, then went to bed and fell asleep. I didn't bother telling Brienne, because she was in Cali anyway. I'm glad to say I only stayed one more night after that. To this day, I still don't know who those guys were or what they wanted, and I haven't been back to dog sit since that incident. Story 19. Last year, I went on a long 10-day road trip. It wasn't to any single place. I just drove in a big loop, stopping at 5 or 6 different cities. I actually didn't book any hotels in advance because I wasn't sure exactly how long I would spend in each city or where I would want to take breaks during the drive. So I was relying on hotels allowing walk-ins. The first 5 nights, I was able to find decent hotels on the course of my drives, but the 6th night I ran into some issues. I was driving between cities and felt my eyes getting heavy around 11 p.m. I wanted to keep going and get to the next major city, and then sleep in a parking lot or something, but there was no way I could make it when I was so sleepy already. I pulled over and contacted a few big-name hotels that were on the way, but none of them were accepting walk-ins at the time. I was getting nervous thinking I might have to park on the side of the road and sleep, which was obviously dangerous, but then I saw a sign for a hotel 10 miles ahead. I drove until I reached the building, then parked by the front. The hotel was small, looking more like a motel, being a single story with a bunch of rooms. There were a few other cars in the parking lot, but it was mostly empty. I got out and went up to the reception desk, asking the woman there if I could have a room. Luckily they had one available, and she gave me a key card. I got my bag from the car and brought it to the room. It was really outdated, but for the price it wasn't all that bad. But only a minute after I went inside, there was a knock at the door. I walked over and opened at a crack, just to see who it was. There was a man, mumbling something to himself, and right when he saw the door open, he pushed into it, trying to force himself into the room while still talking to himself. I put my arm out and stopped him, preventing the man from fully entering. He stopped talking and looked up at me as I told him to leave. After a second, he turned around and walked away. I made sure he actually left, then locked the door. It was really weird, but I didn't feel too threatened because I was sure it was just some crackhead who was lost. I stayed up another 15 minutes, then fell asleep. A couple hours into the night, I woke up to a knock on the door. I was immediately irritated, knowing it had to be that man from earlier. Having learned my lesson, I put the chain bolt on the door before cracking it open. It was a good thing I did, because the second I unlocked the door, the man rammed into it. He started yelling random sentences that made no sense. I backed up right away and called 911. The man didn't let up though. He continued slamming into the door, trying to break in. A minute into the chaos, the man shoved a knife between the door and tried cutting the chain. There was no way I could cut it, but it definitely horrified me to know that he had a knife with him. The yelling, banging, and cutting went on for several minutes before it went quiet. Police showed up a while later, but the man was gone. I don't know what was wrong with him or why he wanted to get inside my room so bad, but he definitely had some bad intentions. It may have just been because he was drugged up but breaking into someone's room with a knife is horrifying. All it takes is one wrong move, like answering a door or leaving it unlocked, for someone like him to take advantage. I don't think he had something against me personally, but I still have this feeling sometimes like I'm being watched. Story 20. I moved across the state to a newly built house. My previous landlord decided he wanted to sell his house, so when our lease agreement was up, he kicked me out. I decided to also lease this new house, but I was honestly really excited for this place. As soon as I moved in though, I noticed my neighbor across the street staring at me several times within the first couple days. He was a middle-aged man, but didn't seem to ever be away from his house. I tried to brush it off, assuming that maybe he was just curious about the new person in the neighborhood, but the more I saw him, the more I realized there was something off about him. He never spoke to anyone, he never smiled, and he never left. He just stayed in his house watching. I would catch glimpses of him through my window and see him standing in his driveway at odd hours of the night. It was starting to freak me out. One night, as I was settling in for bed, I heard a noise outside. It was a scraping sound, like someone dragging a heavy object across the ground. I peeked out the window, and there was my neighbor, dragging what looked like a large ladder across his lawn. It was really late. I had no idea why he would be needing to do any work on his house at this time. I tried to tell myself that I was just being paranoid because I was in a new place surrounded by new people, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about my neighbor. I tried to calm myself and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I saw him outside again. This time, he was standing at the end of my driveway, staring at me through my window. I pulled the curtain shut and I tried to ignore him, but the feeling of him watching me gave me chills. I didn't like that he was by my driveway either, so I quickly got into my car and pulled out of the garage. He was back in his yard by then, but he watched me as I drove away. Things grew a lot worse from here. One night, as I laid in bed, I could clearly hear someone walking in the grass in my backyard, which was fenced in. I got up and looked out the window, but the footsteps stopped. I waited in my bed for probably 30 minutes, but I didn't hear any more footsteps. I got up and checked the window one more time to be safe, and far back in the yard was a figure. It was hard to make them out because it was so dark, but there was definitely someone standing there, watching me. I backed away and called the police, but the man had left before they arrived. I told them all about my creepy neighbor, but they told me there was no evidence of any wrongdoing, and that my neighbor had never been in trouble with the law. I was basically on my own, unless something more serious actually happened. I started to take precautions, locking my doors and windows, and avoiding being outside as much as possible. Even then, I didn't feel much safer. I'd been at the new house for almost 2 weeks at this point, and even thought about breaking my lease agreement. Then something happened. I got home from work late, and pretty much went straight to bed. But in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of something thud against the side of the house. It sounded like it was right up against the wall outside my bedroom though, which was on the second-story floor of my house. I slowly got out of bed, heart racing in my chest, and pulled the curtains back from my window. I jumped back and screamed, seeing my neighbor's face staring at me from just inches away from my window. He was standing on a ladder, trying to look into my bedroom. He quickly climbed down and ran away. I called the police again, and just a few minutes later, they caught him trying to get the ladder down. While he didn't admit to what he was doing, it was very obvious. In the following days, one of my neighbors came by and explained that they had some weird encounters with that neighbor guy as well. They said they saw him looking through their windows as they were coming home from work one day. Part of me wonders if they could have prevented this whole thing from happening to me if they had just reported the guy. But either way, it's over now. Story 21. I lived with my older brother for about 4 years after I finished school. We shared rent on an apartment together since neither of us could afford anything on our own. But during the 4th year, my brother started making better money, and he planned to move out once the lease came to an end. I wasn't making a lot, so I knew I couldn't afford to pay for the apartment alone. I looked around online for a roommate for a few months, but decided to just move out as well and find a cheaper place. I searched up until the last month of our lease at the apartment. My brother had basically moved everything out already, and there was a lot of pressure on me to find somewhere quick, but with my extremely low budget, it wasn't easy. Eventually, though, I stumbled across a listing posted by a homeowner renting out a room in their house. The man's name was Evan. I sent him a text to let him know I was interested, then kept searching. A few minutes later, he responded. We scheduled a time to call later in the day, and when we did, he explained all the details. He said he lived alone in the house and was renting out his spare bedroom, but I'd be able to use all the other rooms in the house too. It sounded great to me, so I agreed to it, and a couple weeks later, I tossed everything in a U-Haul and drove down to the house. Between this time, we'd been texting and calling, and he sent me a bunch of pictures of the house, but I hadn't had the chance to view it in person yet. I got there around noon, parking in the driveway. The house was definitely small, but it looked nice from the outside. Evan was standing in the garage, waving me over. He gave me a quick tour, then helped me unload all of my stuff into my room. Evan seemed like a regular man in his mid-30s, which was almost 10 years older than me, but I didn't really mind. He didn't hold conversations very well, though, and was somewhat shy. Anyway, we finished moving everything inside, and I dropped the U-Haul off. I Ubered back to the house, and by then it was almost 8 p.m., and I was really tired. Evan was on the couch watching TV, so I told him I was going to bed early, and I went to my room. All in all, it seemed like a decent place, and I was happy with it. I unpacked some more, then set out my bed, and by 9 o'clock, I was finally ready to sleep. I walked over to my door to lock it and turn off the lights. But as I reached my hand out, I saw the knob on the door was empty, as in, there was no lock on it. Confused, I opened the door. The lock was on the outside of the door. I stepped into the living room and asked Evan why the bedroom door locked from the outside. He looked confused and said he never noticed that, but he would switch it around tomorrow. I shrugged and said okay, then went back to my room. I was tired and not too worried about it, but it was definitely an odd find. I got in bed and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up. I heard someone moving around in the kitchen, which I assumed was just Evan getting water or something, so I closed my eyes again. A minute later, I heard him walking back down the hallway, but as he was passing my room, he stopped. I opened my eyes and looked at the door. He was standing out there, quietly, for maybe 15 seconds before I heard a click. He locked my door. My stomach dropped, and I felt my face go cold as Evan walked down to his room. As soon as I heard his bedroom door shut, I got up quietly and went over to the door. I tried the handle, and it wouldn't budge. I stood in shock for a few seconds, coming to reality that this man I'd just met has now locked me in a room. My fear started to turn into anger. I called out for Evan, telling him to open the door. It only took a second before I heard Evan run out of his room and over to my door. I heard him place his hand on the door, but he paused for a few seconds before he unlocked it. I swung the door open right away. What the fuck was that? I confronted him. Evan was stumbling words out, saying he just wanted to make sure he was safe because he didn't know me. I understood that concern, but locking someone in a room was not a smart way to go about it. I told him that I was going to pack up and leave in the morning, and I stayed up all night on the couch in the living room, waiting for the U-Haul store to open. At 9 o'clock, I looked into the hallway, seeing Evan's bedroom door was still closed, hopefully meaning he was still asleep. Then I drove straight there and drove the U-Haul back to the house. When I went inside, though, Evan's bedroom door was open. "Evan?" I called out. I walked over to his room and peeked my head inside. His room was empty. I moved my eyes around the room in disbelief. Seeing as things were only getting weirder, I backed out and got straight to moving my stuff. I powered through 2 hours of moving boxes and taking apart my bed. I only had 2 boxes left. I ran inside and picked up another, then rushed to the front door, until Evan appeared in the doorway. "Move," I said. He stared at me, emotionless. After a few seconds, he stepped aside. I hurried past him and shoved the box in the U-Haul. The last box was half full of random food I kept from my old pantry at the apartment. I decided to just leave it. Evan was freaking me out, and I wanted to get away from him as soon as possible. I started closing the back of the U-Haul before Evan interrupted. "You forgot this." He held out the last box. "Oh yeah, thanks." I grabbed it from him and climbed back in the truck. I felt him watching me as I stacked the box, and when I turned, he had his hand on the door. He started pulling it down, trying to close me in. I was able to stop him before the door was even halfway down. I shoved him on the ground, but he got up and ran. Not in the house, but off into the trees away from the house. I didn't know what to think, but I didn't care. I quickly shut the back door and drove away. My brother was nice enough to let me stay with him until I found a new place. I don't know what happened at that house, or what would have happened, but there was definitely something very wrong going on. Story 22. I'm a receptionist at a local hotel, and most of my shifts are overnight. I'm in charge of the front desk, and my main responsibilities are to check in guests, answer phone calls, and keep an eye on the security cameras. It's usually a pretty quiet job since our hotel isn't the biggest or busiest. This night, the hotel was mostly empty. There were only a few guests staying with us. I was sitting at the front desk on my phone when I saw a man start walking towards the doors outside. I stood up and greeted him when he came inside. He looked up at me with bloodshot eyes and said, "I need a room for the night." He was definitely high on something, but regardless, I checked him in and gave him a key to his room. It was standard to allow walk-in bookings when the hotel was less than 75% full. He started walking toward the elevators, and I sat back down and pulled my phone out. A few hours later, I was sitting at the front desk when I heard a noise coming from the hallway. It was a thump sound, like a door trying to be forced open. I got up and walked around the corner to the end of the hallway. The man I checked in a few hours ago was standing there trying to open up one of our maintenance doors. "Can I help you find something?" I asked. He looked over at me with those creepy eyes. I asked again, but he just stared at me. I wasn't really sure what to think. Maybe he was really high and looking for the vending machine or something. I don't know. I didn't want to anger the man though, so I went back to my desk and forgot about it. A good amount of time passed with no activity, no sounds from any of the rooms, nobody entering the building or walking through the halls. It was around 3 in the morning, and I did a small walk around the bottom floor just to keep myself awake and busy. As I got to the hallway by the front desk, though, I heard a very sudden, loud banging coming from one of the rooms. I stopped and listened for a moment, then went up the stairs to the second floor, where I thought it came from. It was very quiet now, which made me somewhat nervous. I walked down the hall, hearing nothing, but when I reached the end, one of the room's doors was open. I listened again for a second, before lightly knocking. Nobody responded. I cautiously peeked inside, unsure of what to expect. It seemed empty. I wasn't comfortable walking all the way inside though, so I couldn't really look around, but I was sure nobody was inside. I closed the door and looked at the room number. 112. That was the room I'd given to the man. I never saw him exit the building though. I quickly walked back down to the front desk. I looked at all the security cameras we had in the lobby and outside the building, but the man didn't turn up. I jumped. It was the hotel phone. One of the rooms was calling. I picked it up. "Hello, how can I help you?" There was a woman on the line, telling me about some man knocking on her door in the middle of the night. I apologized and assured her I would take care of it. I hung up and took a deep breath. I was getting really nervous now. I walked around the desk, but then again the phone started ringing. It was someone else from a different room this time, saying he had the same experience as the other woman, someone knocking at his door in the middle of the night. I called the police right away. I stood by the front doors until they arrived, just in case I needed a quick escape. Luckily they came before anything happened, but they didn't find the man. Instead, they found a broken window in his room, where he likely jumped out of. It was on the second story though, so I'm not sure how he managed to get away without some major injuries. Later, while the police were still searching, they got a report that the car he used to pay for the room was stolen. It's unclear what the man intended to do, or why he was knocking on people's doors. I'm thankful none of them opened their doors though, because this case could have been much worse if they had. This happened to me a couple years ago, after I just rented and moved into a new house. Story 23. The first week went by quick, with no issues at all. I unpacked, bought some new furniture, and got everything set up the way I wanted. The main reason I moved there was because I got a work-from-home job, so having a quiet place to work was important. This house was far from others, and gave me a peaceful work environment. One morning, after making breakfast and sitting down to work, I got a knock at the front door. I walked over and answered it. It was my landlord. He was smiling and asked me how I was doing. "Yeah, I'm doing good, thank you," I said, still unsure why he was here. He tried to make small talk for a minute before saying he was just checking in on me, and then he left. I went back to work, but that was definitely weird. I didn't mind him being friendly, but he could have just texted me instead of randomly dropping by the house. The rest of the day went by, and I'd forgotten about it. After dinner, I went for a walk around my street. My neighbors' houses were well spread out, so I never actually got a chance to see the other houses in the neighborhood. I walked for maybe half an hour, then turned back. As I rounded the corner toward my house, I saw a car parked on the side of the street. It wasn't directly in front of my house, but there weren't any other houses nearby. When I walked up and passed it, I realized it was the same car my landlord had in the driveway when he was showing me the house, but there was nobody in the car. I hurried up the driveway and went inside. I looked out the windows, trying to see if he was in the yard or something, but I didn't see him. I wasn't scared really, but just uncomfortable and weirded out by the situation. I had just walked around the whole neighborhood, so I didn't know where else he could even be other than the house. After a while, I stopped looking because I wasn't seeing anything. Another hour or so went by until a knock came from the front door. Looking out the peephole, I saw it was my landlord again. I sighed in annoyance and opened the door. He was smiling again, asking how I was doing. "Yeah, I'm still good, thanks. Can you just make sure to let me know when you plan on dropping by next time, though?" I said politely, try not to be rude. He apologized and said he just wanted to make sure I was happy with the place. I smiled and said I had to get back to work, then shut the door. Something about that interaction, the way he talked and the way he looked at me, was just really creepy. Obviously the guy didn't understand social cues, but I don't know, he just rubbed me the wrong way. I went to bed that night, thinking of the best way to tell him I want to be left alone. He was my landlord, and this was technically his house, but there are rules they have to follow when renting it out. I fell asleep, still unsure of what to do, but I was woken up not long after. It was well past midnight when a knock at my door forced me up. I turned on the lights and went downstairs, the whole time thinking that if it was the landlord again, I would be furious. I checked out the peephole and sure enough, it was him again. I swung open the door. "What are you doing here? You can't be here right now. You need to leave," I said strictly, barely holding back my anger. That's when I saw he was holding a duffel bag. He explained that there was an immediate repair he needed to do on the pipes in the basement. He said he had an alarm hooked up on his phone that went off saying there was a minor gas leak. None of the alarms actually went off in the house though, so this was really suspicious. I told him I'd just call someone in the morning, and went to close the door when he suddenly forced his body inside, pretending to not notice I was closing the door. I just stood there now, not knowing what to say or do. He looked at me, fully in my house, and smiled. "It'll only take a minute." He put down the duffel bag and asked me to follow him, so he could show me the problem with the pipe. He opened the basement door and started walking down, and I hesitantly followed down a few steps before I thought of something. "Hold on, I'm gonna go get my phone so I can take pictures of it. I'll be right back," I said, hurrying back up the steps. Thankfully he stayed. I rushed to my room and got my phone and keys, then went to the front door. But before I left, I quickly went over to the duffel bag and opened it just to make sure I wasn't wrong. Inside the bag, there were no tools. At least, not normal ones. I didn't know what they were, and I didn't have time to figure it out. I heard him coming back up as I rushed out of the house and into my car, driving away. I called the police as I drove to a parking lot nearby. What happened after this still bothers me every day. My landlord was still there when they showed up, however, the duffel bag he came with was not. They never found it. All that ended up happening was I was able to move out without having to pay the fee of breaking the lease. Him showing up randomly and being creepy, or even inviting himself in, wasn't enough to do anything. I of course took the deal though, moving out right away. But, in the back of my mind, I know he's out there, probably doing whatever he was going to do to me, to someone else. And there's nothing I can do about it. Interested in more real-life mysteries? Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. Leave me a comment and I'll read you. Enjoy life because there is only one life.